Part 1. After dressing up as the evil girl in the second game, I opened my eyes and found myself in the Shur. Author, Mei Cheng. Chapter 1. A month ago, Sierra hadn't figured out how she had traveled from the beach in Whitby to this place. She had brought her notebook to the beach to find inspiration for writing a book, and the salty sea breeze and fine sand blew into her eyes. When she opened her eyes again, everything around her had changed. Her sleeveless striped vest disappeared and turned into a long black skirt with black ruffles on the collar and cuffs. She stood with a group of wealthy people in elegant retro clothes. Standing in a cemetery, the notebook in her hand became a bouquet of gorgeous lilies bloomed, and the broken tear ducts could not control the bursting tears. The priest prayed for him in his ears, and everyone looked sad and solemn. The current situation is a bit inexplicable chaos. Who died? She lowered her head and struggled to look at the square stone tablet in front of her toes with blurred eyes. There was an unfamiliar name engraved on it. Clemens. Poor Sierra, everything is going to be okay. You just don't see her anymore, she will always be there for you and love you, Sierra. I am sorry for your loss. Sierra, who was standing in the front row, finally figured out from the hugs and comforts who was under the stone monument, her mother who died of tuberculosis. What is more ridiculous is that she was thrown into a welfare institution in London when she was still an infant and no more than the height of an arm. Therefore, the mother who died of illness in front of her did not belong to her, but to the body that her soul had passed through. The shock and panic caused by time travel were not suitable to be expressed on such an occasion. She put down Lily and walked through the entire funeral process with a heavy heart and limbs, and spent a few days figuring out the details of her identity. Everyone in Leicestershire respectfully called her Miss Sarah. Her dead mother, Clemens, was a countess who was squeezed out by her husband's mistress. They were a poor and pitiful mother and daughter. The plot of the supporting characters is so familiar, I seem to have seen it somewhere before. Miss Sarah, Miss Anna called you to express her condolences. I hope you can go home and reunite with her and Earl Lizzie as soon as possible, Butler Carey said. Back to Cumbonia, she asked. Yes, miss, you are going back to Cumbonia? Sierra knew where she had been blown down by Whitby's evil wind. There is only one word separating Cumbria and Cumbria. The former is a county in northern England with the Irish Sea, and the latter is a fictional county that the author of the novel was too lazy to name and arbitrarily changed a word to become a region, including Lillany. The kingdom, she remembered, was also fictionalized after Britain. Anna, Lizzie, Clemens. All the names and chronological backgrounds are matched with a book in her memory. The strategy novel titled All the Male Protagonists Love Me became a hit on the internet a year ago and was even released as a co-branded game. It tells the story of a bizarre 19th century fantasy world, 3 non-human species and the heroine Anna Eleven's Mary Sue Otome love story. And the Sierra she traveled through time was the vicious stepsister who kept getting in the way of their relationship. She remembered that in order to satisfy the bad taste of customers, the game operators had specially designed many death methods for this emotional troublemaker for players to choose from, 360 different ways. Sierra sighed with melancholy in her eyes. Every day she hoped to wake up in the morning and escape from this strange and long nightmare. She was still sunbathing on the beach in Whitby, but a month had passed since the funeral. In those visits and comforts that came and went, she had to admit that she had become a super cannon fodder, the #1 stumbling block on the road of love between the male protagonists and the female protagonists. Butler Carey came over and said, Miss Sarah, your luggage has been put in the car. You have to rush to the port to board the ship. Sierra really didn't want to leave this magnificent place to find trouble with Anashi and face the ending of being brutally murdered by the male protagonists, but there was a novel way to die in the co-branded game. If she didn't return to Cambona County, she would also be exploited. Earl Chi was forced to marry a domestically violent earl and died violently. It was death anyway, with no way to survive at all. Sierra had no choice but to bid farewell to the housekeeper and board the classic car heading for the port. She leaned on the soft pillow and looked out the car window at the green forest path, her eyes gradually becoming irritated. Call out. A vigorous deer suddenly jumped out from the green forest path next to it, followed closely by a huge beast with extremely fast speed. Damn it! The driver yelled and stepped on the brakes, but it was too late. The front of the car slammed the black bear-like beast several meters away and rolled to the ground. The harsh braking made Sierra jump forward and hit the soft backrest. What's going on? She covered her forehead and raised her head in pain. It looks like we hit a bear, the driver said tremblingly. The front of the entire classic car was dented, and the broken windshield and repeated white smoke made the front sight blurry. Sierra opened the door and got out of the car and walked forward. The driver, who was holding his forehead and bleeding profusely, got out of the car and called nervously from behind, "Miss. Don't go there. It's dangerous." A giant gray-brown beast lay 2 or 3 meters in front of the car. It was as huge as a horse. It whimpered in pain, and its blood spread in the haystacks beneath it. Sierra trembled when she saw this scene. It was basically a deformed werewolf, and a brown bear was not as big as it. How could the wolf tribe, which has always kept its life experience secret, transform and appear on the road of humans? A rustling sound rang around. Sierra stood in front of the car and looked around cautiously. A black shadow emerged from the jungle, and a strong figure jumped high and stepped onto the roof of the crashed classic car. Clang, the entire roof of the car sank and buckled with a roar. The driver screamed in horror, and when Sierra turned around, he was so frightened that he fell to the gravel ground and fainted. A huge black shadow stood on the roof of the car, and the shadow that enveloped her deprived her of all light. Under the black fur all over her body, golden brown beast eyes stared at her condescendingly, and the unconcealed murderous intent almost overflowed from her eyes. How does it feel to be targeted by the most dangerous creature in the Otome world? The limbs are trembling, the heartbeat is disordered, and the legs are weak. Ho ho ho. One after another, several giant wild wolves with colorful fur sprang out of the forest. 2 ran to the injured wolf and nudged it with their heads. They made grunting sounds from time to communicate with their companions. "We should kill her, she found out our secret. She's just a child." Yalang was dissatisfied. Child? The child also knows that a wolf cannot be bigger than a horse. What's more, she is a noble and she will tell it. Sierra couldn't understand what they were saying, but the beast staring at her had obviously lowered its forelimbs, ready to jump up and pounce on her at any time. The situation is not good. She cannot remember whether Sierra in the article has experienced this experience. She must not be buried here. I know Eric. He and his tribe live in Cambodia County. I know you are werewolves. I have kept it a secret for a long time. She puffed up her chest, adjusted her breathing, and kept a calm face. I didn't know you were werewolves. Why did you run out onto the road rashly? That wolf needs medical treatment now. It will take a lot of time to cure him with your way of life. I can spend money to find the best doctor for him. Completed books. After falling in love with the supreme god of light, transporting to the stars, conquering crazy commanders with food, the mermaids she raised in captivity are gods. I train bosses in the apocalypse. The cook takes over in the apocalypse. After dressing up as the evil girl in the second game, I opened my eyes and found myself in the Shur. Author, Mei Cheng. Chapter 2. Her words got the wolves talking again. She knew about Eric. They let a human who knew the secret wander around and we didn't hear anything. Calm down, she's not to blame for this. Rooney suddenly lost control and transformed and rushed onto the road before he became an adult. It was our guard who failed in his duty. The black wolf with its forelimbs lowered shook its head, stood upright and jumped out of the car. The huge wolf form instantly transformed into a strong man. We can keep you, but the driver also knows the secret. He lowered his head and kicked the unconscious driver. She took a deep breath, looked at the shirtless werewolf in front of her, and calmed down. We had a car accident on the way to the port. I was slightly injured and the driver suffered a serious head injury and was unconscious. It was your people who showed up to save us. If he asked about the wolf afterwards, the doctor could only think that there was a memory disorder. This was a good reason. The wolves on the opposite side looked at each other, and the dangerous atmosphere dissipated. They agreed. Let's go, take Rooney to the big hospital. The handsome, naked man with long black hair walked towards her, and before Sierra could react, he lifted her up with his strong arms. Sierra hooked her arms around his neck, and the hot body that was close to her enveloped her like a big heater. Wait, she pointed at the car with her free hand and shouted hurriedly, luggage. I have to catch the boat. If she doesn't catch the boat, Lizzie will marry her to the domestically violent Earl according to the death ending, which is not okay. The long-haired man kicked the deformed car door open, and a wolf squeezed in and took out her luggage. Another picked up the unconscious driver, and the group rushed into the woods with the two wounded. Not long after lying in the arms of the naked man, when he rushed into the forest, Sierra felt her eyes blurred, and her whole body was thrown into the air by a force. There was only a loud explosion in her ears, which just disappeared. The missing giant black wolf appears again. Sierra, who was thrown into the air, suddenly fell back on the smooth and plush wolf's back. The feeling of weightlessness made her scream. Her fingers tightly grasped its thick fur, and her legs were tightly clamped on both sides of his body. What's the speed of a wolf pack? An off-road vehicle was wading through mountains and rivers in the forest. Their speed was so fast that Sierra couldn't see their movement clearly with the naked eye. The fast-running route continued to climb up, getting steeper and steeper. This did not slow them down at all. Black the wolf easily carried her and jumped from one rock to another. In front of her was a steep cliff that she was about to cross. She could hear the sound of waves from the turbulent river several meters deep below. The moment the black wolf jumped out bravely, Sierra's heart was hanging in the air, and the wide-brimmed hat on her head had been blown away by the strong wind and branches. After an hour's drive, it only took the wolves more than 10 minutes to reach the small woods near the hospital. Everyone hid under the shadow of the trees. Sierra almost lost the strength to climb off the wolf's back, but the transformed man held her up. Standing still, she held onto the tree trunk tremblingly and gasped for air. By the time Sierra was able to control her weak calves to walk, they had transformed back into human form and put on Henley shirts and casual pants that they didn't know where they came from. Each one of them looked as healthy and strong as a normal person. A young boy with a sunny face walked up to her and said, "Your hat. When you threw it away just now, I rushed over and caught it." It's a bit like the sense of déjà vu when a dog plays frisbee, Sierra thought inexplicably. She took the wide-brimmed hat and thanked her sincerely. The largest hospital in Leicestershire is where Clemens used to live. The doctors and nurses here all know her well. When they saw that she brought two seriously injured patients, they immediately started treatment. Sierra, who was fine, looked at the clock hanging on the wall of the hospital. It was almost time to sail the ship. She put on her hat and took her luggage, and hurriedly said to the long-haired man in the lead who had been staring at her, "I have to catch the boat. All the medical expenses here will be credited to my account. You can stay here until he healed." The man stopped her and announced his name, "My name is Hynek." Sarah turned to him and nodded, "Hynek, my name is Sarah. Wait until next summer, I will go to Cambania County to visit the tribe there." He stared at her beautiful eyes, his heart moved. "I hope Eric hasn't branded you by then." Sierra was stunned and waved her hand subconsciously, "He won't love me." Thank God Eric didn't tear Anashi apart for her. Hynek's thick black eyebrows raised, his expression somewhat meaningful. "It's his loss." Not knowing what his expression meant, Sierra hurriedly borrowed a hospital car with her luggage and rushed to the port. The spring weather in April was still braving the early cold, and the car she ordered was blocked on the port road. Sierra simply got out of the car with her luggage and went on foot. After racing in the jungle, she wrapped herself up in a black woolen coat, enjoying the exciting exercise. Her cheeks were so cold that there was still no blood at all. Vendors selling cigarettes and alcohol were shouting and hawking on the street across the port. Classic cars of wealthy merchants and nobles rushing to catch ships were struggling on the crowded roads. Small business owners or entrepreneurs who had bought tickets for low-class ships came over in horse-drawn carriages. The congested road made way for the horses were suddenly frightened, and the scene was crowded and chaotic. Sarah, who was walking aside, witnessed 2 car accidents within a few minutes, one of which was caused by a speeding black classic car. It didn't care whether it hit people on the crowded road, and honked its horn all the way, arrogantly. His appearance even caused a horse on a wheel to almost crash into a fishing gear repair shop along with the car. Facing this novel and ancient scene, Sarah was shocked to see it, but as the culprit of the accident, the classic car stopped near the first-class boarding gate without looking back. A young servant in a suit and tie got out of the car. She had never seen such a pale person before. The black satin cloth covered his white body like a corpse cloth. He went around to the other side of the car and bent down, respectfully. He opened the car door to greet the owner inside. Sierra didn't know what was so interesting about this, but anyway, her eyes were involuntarily fixed on the car door. The man with blonde hair bent over and got out of the car. He was wearing a simple black button-down coat, and his hands hanging down by his sides were wearing a pair of leather gloves. He looked up indifferently through the crowd of people and looked at the cruise ship that was almost covering half of the sky. The flow of people automatically avoided his surroundings, and the posture that could not be ignored was in stark contrast to all the chaos around him. The culprit who allowed his servants to drive wildly was just as Sarah imagined, a noble man with no forgiving heart and full of indifference. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. After dressing up as the evil girl in the second game, I opened my eyes and found myself in the Shur. Author, Mei Cheng. Chapter 3. Boom. Black smoke billowed out of one of the royal cruise ship's blue chimneys, and the shrill whistles urging people to board the ship were mixed with the chatter of crowded people. Sarah withdrew her gaze and walked all the way to the second-class boarding port. The ship has a dedicated waiter for second-class guests. Sarah handed the luggage to him and followed the flow of people and stepped onto the elm plywood. After the piercing whistle sounded for the 3rd time, the first and most luxurious royal cruise ship in the Kingdom of Lilani officially set off from Leicestershire across the ocean to Cambodia. Thousands of passengers cheered, holding small red and yellow flags waving in the air. Several large boiler rooms at the stern burned a large amount of coal. The 3 blue chimneys emitted billowing black smoke. The combustion gas slowly started the cruise ship. Depart port. In a hazy sky, the sun broke in from the accumulated clouds, and the warm orange light shone on the face, dispelling a bit of the dampness and coldness of the seaside. Sierra took off her wide-brimmed hat, her dark brown curly hair flying in the wind, and she narrowed her eyes slightly. Sella. Surprised voices sounded from behind. Sarah turned around, not looking at the girl who made the noise. Instead, she looked at the outer corridor of the first-class cabin above. She once again saw the nobleman who was racing randomly. He stood in a shadow under the sloping pillars, just avoiding all the sunlight. It was an indescribable face, like a god on a Gothic stone sculpture. The overly pale and deep face was expressionless, and the bright light was unintentional. It leaked onto the back of his hand that was placed on the railing. He immediately put down his hand, a look of disgust appearing on his finely carved face. He was obviously wearing leather gloves, but he was subconsciously avoiding the sun. Like a vampire. A sudden thought occupied Sarah's mind. The nobleman who was looking into the distance suddenly lowered his head, and his dark and empty eyes shot accurately in her direction. "Sierra? What are you looking at?" Sierra suddenly retracted her raised chin and returned her eyes to the girl in front of her who almost occupied her entire sight. "Hello. We met at the funeral. I'm Betty." The dark-haired girl smiled at her and greeted her. "I remember, Aunt Fen's daughter. You also went to Cambodia County." Sierra nodded. As a novelist's basic qualities, a month of life was enough for her to sort out the huge and complicated connections. "I'm just here for a sea trip. It would be best if you are willing to invite me to sit with Earl Lizzie." Betty smiled and then deliberately added, "I hope you have the power to make the decision." Sierra fell silent and her eyes became cold. "If there is a chance." The sea breeze on the deck was too strong. She didn't want to stay under that deep and searching gaze for a long time, so she put on her wide-brimmed hat and left in a hurry. In the first-class corridor, the blond nobleman lowered his eyelids, and a wrinkle appeared on his smooth and beautiful forehead. Shutting herself back into the room, Sierra suppressed her beating chest. At that moment, she almost looked into each other's eyes. This was definitely not a lingering fear after peeping, but fear that the person would see her. The inexplicable changes in emotions were like a certain death ending pressing on her forehead, making her shudder. The second-class cabin that Earl Lizzie had booked for her was very good, with red patterned wallpaper, expensive leisure chairs, an oak bed with green curtains on the corners, and a separate bathroom. The electric lamp on the top was in the shape of several drooping roses, and the light emitted by the edges was a bit dazzling. She turned off the light, refused the dinner reminded by the exclusive waiter, took off all her clothes, pulled down the curtains, and lay down on the bed to catch up on her sleep. The ship's porch was always lively, and the laughter and movement at the door gradually stopped until the light of the second day rose from the shoreline. There was a little commotion in the early morning, and the sound of shattering glass and wine glasses exploded above Sierra's head, and another woman screamed. Sierra suddenly opened her eyes in the darkness, and chaotic footsteps were trampling back and forth on her forehead. She frowned and sat up, holding onto the mattress. A gust of cold and clammy wind came in from outside the curtains. It was because the window in the room had been forgotten to close. As soon as she opened the curtain and stuffed her feet into her shoes, a wide red skirt flashed past the window and fell rapidly. Before Sierra could figure out what it was, the sound of falling into the water was like a heavy stone breaking the sea. Someone had fallen overboard, from the room above hers, and that was the first-class floor. Sierra kicked off her shoes and ran barefoot to the window and looked down. The surging water rose to the hem of a woman's skirt, and large amounts of red blood surged along the advancing waves. She was so alert in the cold wind that the down on her face stood up. Early on the second morning of the voyage, she witnessed a murder. The deceased was not a noble, but a barmaid serving the first-class cabin. She was disheveled when she was salvaged, and her bloody skirt was spread out on the elm deck. The skirt should have been white before it was dyed. Putting on a thin blanket, Sierra stood behind the pillar in the second-class corridor and watched a servant who was wearing a black suit that was more eye-catching than everyone around him walk to the deck. He said a few words to the people who salvaged the body. Before the sun fully shone on the ship, they put the body into a sack, tied it with stones, and threw it back into the sea. A few servants took a few wooden brushes and, among the rich, before getting up and moving around, wash the deck so that no trace of blood is left. Sierra, who was watching the whole process, frowned. She had an impression of the outstanding servant in a suit with a straight posture. He was a member of the nobles racing cars in the port. He lives above her? Sierra raised her head, her eyes thinking. What title does this person hold? Killing a maid in public is a scandal that is enough to convict any nobleman. Does he not care at all that people like her who are peeping in the dark will spread the news of the murder? Sierra? You got up so early. Betty's lazy voice behind her startled her. A little seasick, Sierra turned around, wrapped the thin blanket around her body and walked into the house. "You didn't attend the dance last night, but you have to come to the party tonight." Betty followed and smiled. "It's just drinking coffee and playing games." "Come on, Sierra, everyone wants to see you." Miss Sarah, a cold and not very polite male voice, interrupted their conversation. Betty's face darkened at the servant's disrespectful manner. However, Sierra's mood was different from hers. She looked cautiously at the handsome servant walking towards her. He was still on the deck a moment ago. He looked younger and more tender than when seen from a distance, which made people suspect that the noble was illegally employing child labor. "The Duke of Rosehill invites you to have dinner tonight." He bent slightly to express his intention. "Duke?" Betty's gloomy attitude suddenly turned into surprise. She turned her head and looked at Sierra, with jealousy in her eyes. "After dressing up as the evil girl in the second game, I opened my eyes and found myself in the Shur." Author, Mei Cheng. Chapter 4. Different from Betty's envy and jealousy, Sierra froze on the spot when she heard the name, and part of the memory information about the Duke was suddenly filled into her mind. The most brutal of the three male protagonists of Anasai is a vampire with the ability to read minds. As cannon fodder, one of her death endings in the game line is to be sucked into a mummy by him. The location is in box 3 of the restaurant. After the manservant said that, he straightened his back and left proudly. "Sierra, how do you know the Duke? Did you not come to the ball last night to meet him?" Betty asked closely. Sierra, whose hands and feet were cold, didn't want to say a word to her. After the valet left, she went back to the room, locked the door, and slumped down on a soft chair. No wonder the exclamation she made on the plywood at that time attracted his attention. He simply heard the words she said about vampires among the many cluttered thoughts. No wonder no one came out even if a maid died at sea this morning. After investigation, this vampire Duke, who controls most of the kingdom's underground black business chain, doesn't care about the hundreds of pages of laws. The bones at his feet could probably pile up to form Ben Nevis. Sierra poured herself a cup of black tea with shaking hands. The already cooled tea poured into her stomach, but it could not calm her panic. Before boarding the ship, she fully planned to try her best to establish a good relationship with the male protagonists if she met them and not interfere with their relationship with Anna 11. Now when he heard her saying that Rosehill looked like a vampire, she witnessed it again. A murder related to him would be enough reason for him to drink her blood at night. Sierra put down the cup and held her forehead in pain. Unlucky start, really unlucky start. She should go to a large party on the ship that night, so as to avoid the Duke's dinner invitation, or perhaps she should stay in the party room all night long, where she would be relatively safe from the crowd. Despairing, Sierra fell on the table, weak. The death of a maid in the morning did not cause any waves on the ship. Towards evening, it started to rain lightly on the seaside and the wind and waves became stronger. Sierra, who was still in mourning, took out a long sequined black dress with exposed arms from the few clothes left in her suitcase, put on elbow-length gloves, casually tied up her brown curly hair and went out. At 7 o'clock in the evening, the public restaurant and bar officially opened. Wealthy merchants and nobles in rich costumes came and went, looking for targets for possible marriages or business cooperation. Sierra, who could only wear a black dress, was undoubtedly very conspicuous among a group of women who were blessed with shining jewelry. She occupied a small round table on the ground floor far away from the box alone, and her back looked lonely. "Didn't you say that Sierra was invited by the Duke?" In the private room on the second floor, the glamorous woman raised her wine glass and touched Betty, who was also confused, with her elbow. "The valet personally invited me, and I was there." She insisted that she was not lying. "So? The Duke temporarily broke the contract?" Betty raised her eyebrows, swung her wine glass and gloated, "It's excusable, who doesn't know how poor she is? That's really pathetic, go ahead and invite her over." Amidst the vague jeers, Betty walked over to Sira, who was huddled in the corner drinking. Sira, who was intoxicated by the rich aroma of wine, was caught off guard when she was tapped on the shoulder. "Sierra, the party has started, come up and sit with us." Betty's tone was pitiful, and the sarcasm in her eyes was well hidden. Of course Sierra asked for it. She was sitting in the lobby because she couldn't find their party box. Her agreement also made Betty feel that she had been broken even more, and her expression became sympathetic. "The Duke of Rosehill is really ungentlemanly, treating a lady like this." Sarah, who slapped him for no reason and took the initiative to break the contract, immediately clarified, "I didn't agree to go at all. He is a gentleman." "Sierra, everyone on the ship wants to marry the Duke. Lying is not a good behavior." Betty rolled her eyes at her. "You don't have to be so face-saving." Sierra was speechless for a moment. The expressionless young manservant stood in the corner of the box, looking through the window at the girl who was going upstairs from the other side of the hanging ladder. "I'll bring her." The Duke, who was sitting on the soft leather sofa, slowly raised his eyelids, took off his black gloves and placed his fingers lightly on the table. He wore several rings of different colors on his knuckles. "Need not." She discovered the secret? "She's afraid of you." The manservant turned around. "I haven't broken the rules yet." He stood up and walked to the window. The shivering feeling of thorns on her back made Sira shiver as she was about to enter. She turned around. Only the giant crystal lamp hanging from the top and falling to the first floor was emitting dazzling light. The door of the box on the opposite side of the corridor was open, as if someone had just left there. "Sella, welcome." The atmosphere in the private room was very lively. The charcoal fire in the fireplace was burning brightly, there were exquisite pastries on the long low table, and the aroma of coffee mixed with different perfumes made Salatin feel dizzy. The suffocating smell of incense powder made me wonder how they could stay there for so long. Faced with a dozen pairs of sympathetic eyes looking at her, Sierra was sure that Betty had spread the news that Rosehill had let her go. She now hoped that he would not be so petty as to take this matter into account and argue with her. She greeted everyone with a normal expression and sat down on the sofa while remaining dignified. They enthusiastically asked about her current situation, trying to find out any special novel gossip about her unfortunate life experience. She seemed to have become a topic of discussion and a toy among the nobles. "Don't embarrass her. She is already sad enough to be let off by the Duke." Betty, a good-natured person, came out to persuade her. "But Sira, you should strive for a decent property when you go home this time. You are penniless now." These words made Sira's situation worse. A beautiful but penniless nobleman was not worthy of men's pursuit of the truth. Several gentlemen who wanted to sit next to her and talk to her went to the side. Sarah, who was at the center of public opinion, was holding a piece of lemon cake and eating it slowly. She glanced at the well-meaning Betty from the corner of her eye and said, "Betty, all the harsh knives will be pierced into your family members. Your friends will be miserable in the future. Are you going to do this unexpectedly? Spread it widely? Belittle and ridicule?" Betty's smile froze, and before the party came to a complete standstill, several lively ladies came out to smooth things over and liven up the atmosphere, and no one tried to provoke Sierra again. These topics discussed at the top really couldn't dig out a piece of flesh from Sierra and make her lose face. Instead, she thanked Betty for helping her clean up the men around her and leaving enough space for her to stay here in silence for a while. Night. She ate the cake gracefully and slowly, picked up the champagne glass on the table, stood up and walked to the window for some fresh air. After dressing up as the evil girl in the second game, I opened my eyes and found myself in the Shur. Author, Mei Cheng. Chapter 5. It stopped raining after 9 o'clock, and the salty sea breeze outside the opposite window revealed a biting coldness. A woman's poodle lay at her feet, and its dark brown curly hair rubbed against her, exposing a small section of its ankle. Sierra bent down and scratched its chin. Boom. Among the classical music, the sound of a foreign object hitting the hull was not abrupt, but Sierra, who was leaning against the window, suddenly straightened up and looked outside. She couldn't see the large deck on the other side of the mast from her current position. She stretched out her neck and tried to look back. Close to the stern boiler room, several fishermen responsible for providing fresh food to the nobles were struggling to pull a large deck with a spreader net. It was very dark, and the light from the gas lamp was not very far away, but it was enough for Sierra to see clearly the giant fish tail illuminated by the light. She froze for 3 seconds by the window, turned around, put the champagne on the wine cabinet, and rushed out. "Hey, Sierra! Where are you going?" Sierra completely ignored the shouts behind her, and her brain was spinning rapidly. The mermaid was captured and brought to Cambania County to meet an Asai. She might be able to establish a good relationship with him and deal with him during the voyage. It is much safer than dealing with the executioner of Rose Hill. That guy's mind-reading ability was a ticking time bomb for her. The restaurant is in the middle of the third-class cabin. The stairs connect to the bottom deck. Several drying rooms and cold storage rooms pass behind it. The small deck at the end is where fishermen fish for seafood. Here the location is discreet to prevent passengers from smelling the fishy smell of disemboweled fish. Sela ran down the hanging ladder and almost bumped into the waiter holding the tray. After saying a hasty apology, she ran through the public restaurant and down the narrow stairs, running to the back from the open-air walkway on the ground floor. The iron walkway was still wet, and waves would roll up and hit it inside at any time. The extremely cold low temperature and humid air made goosebumps appear on Sierra's arms. She crossed her arms, stepped on black leather high heels, and ran. It was very unsatisfactory. Several fishermen and crew members shouted in the big waves, "Tighten the net! Tighten the hanger! Pinch it with the net! What kind of monster is this? Is it a sea monster?" The nervous and excited tone was blurred in the sound of the waves. Wet vapor covered her face, hair, and clothes. She leaned against the door of the refrigerator room, raising her neck and trying to look at the things illuminated by the flickering gas lamps. A huge net was lowered on the floor by a hanger, entangled with a wild beast that was struggling and twisting like a shark. The long black tail fin tore a piece of fishing net out and slapped on the elm deck. The sharp mesh its scales were torn apart, and traces of blood dripped down the greasy tail mucus. "Shut the hell down! Is he going to smash through our turbine room?" A fisherman took out a fish-scraping knife and walked towards it. "I'll do it." A big wave suddenly surged up, causing the entire hull to shake violently. Sierra hugged the railing beside her and almost fell into the sea. The waves that hit her made her skirt wet, but she was completely unaware of it. He didn't notice anything, and his eyes were fixed on the big net. The light from the gas lamp was very dim, but the long silver hair that was as lustrous as satin leaked wetly from the net. The beast lying in the net raised his head, and the hair stuck to his face and neck. A string of low and low weird whispers came from its mouth. He seemed to be singing and talking. Sierra's eyes were in a daze for a moment as she hugged the railing. She recalled inexplicably the death of the mermaid when she faced it. She was like a fragile piece of human skin, with fragments of flesh and blood, and was slapped against the rocks by his tail fin. And died. When she was brought back to consciousness by the scream, her cream-brown eyes widened in shock. The fisherman who walked towards the mermaid with a knife raised the knife and stabbed himself in the abdomen. "Rudolph!" Several crew members panicked. "It's the siren singing." "Cover his mouth," someone quickly reacted. "Damn it hurt Rudolph, I'm going to get the gun," said a strong fisherman. "Gun?" Sierra was startled, and couldn't bear it any longer and came out of the aisle to the deck. Several fishermen saw her and said quickly, "Hey miss. It's dangerous here. Leave quickly." "Don't use the gun," Sierra yelled, "he's already hurt." Unexpectedly, she was not afraid of the creature in the net and actually protected it. The fishermen looked at each other. Because she was a noble, they had to lower their posture and said, "Miss, you don't understand how dangerous it is." "I know. It's just that you have to really shoot him. She thinks he has the ability to kill everyone present, and the halo of the male protagonist cannot be overshadowed." Sierra stepped closer to the big net, and the sharp black tail fin gradually became clear. She took a deep breath, looked at him with a trembling voice and said, "You guys hurry up and send the injured to the doctor. It's going to be broken, he can't sell it at a good price." "Do you know this siren?" "It's a mermaid." Sierra corrected his name, turned around and said, "You can't kill him. He is an opportunity for you to make a fortune without worrying about food and clothing." The well-informed aristocratic lady said that they would make a fortune, so no one would question the problem. Two fishermen dragged the injured person away from the splint, and the remaining few narrowed the fishing net and fastened the sharp net lines into it body, making it unable to move even half a minute. The hanging fish tail fell on the deck and stopped moving due to the force and pain. Sierra carefully went around his tail and found the face covered by the messy hair in the net. The bare skin on his upper body is crystal clear, and his eyes are hidden behind his hair. The lake blue eyes, which are the same as human pupils, are covered with a light film, and his fierce eyes are like looking at prey, which is comparable to the most dangerous predators on land. Sierra ignored the cold and wet hem of her skirt stuck to her legs and slowly squatted beside the net. His gaze frightened her, and the blood he shed stung her eyes. She suppressed her fear and held the hands on her knees tightly. She heard her dry voice saying to him softly, "I don't mean any harm. I'm here to help you." The cruelty and vigilance in those eyes had not faded a bit. If it weren't for the pain caused by the fishing net cutting his skin, Sierra believed that he would definitely bite her head off. She swallowed and pointed her fingers carefully towards the broken fish tail and some body wounds. "I can help you treat it." After waiting for a while, he still didn't give her any reaction. Sierra thought that he couldn't speak. She remembered that he seemed to speak under the guidance of Anna 11. She pursed her lips, turned to several fishermen and said, "This matter must be kept secret. If it causes a sensation, you won't get a single cent of the value he brings. Please support the new book." Many recommendations and comments. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. After dressing up as the evil girl in the second game, I opened my eyes and found myself in the Shur. Author, Mei Cheng. Chapter 6. "Miss, what should I do?" "Put him in the cargo hold. When the cargo is unloaded at the shore, you can unload it as the last unclaimed cargo." Sarah's proposal was once again unanimously approved by several fishermen and crew members. They violently tore off the fishing nets and dragged the exhausted mermaid on the deck. The long black fish tail leaked blood along the damp elm boards. She stood there for a while, soaked to the skin, then shuddered and turned around to run back. Sarah also remembers that there was a hospital on the Royal cruise ship near the D-Splint, far away from the cabin. When she took a moment to run there, the newly injured crew member Rudolph was receiving emergency treatment. Two medical staff were disinfecting him, and the only surgeon was questioning the crew members who brought him here. While no one was paying attention, Sierra quietly opened the glass cabinet near the door and took away the antibacterial drugs and iodophor from inside. It was already too late to reach the cargo bay again. A large number of valuable goods transported by wealthy merchants were displayed among them. After walking through one shelf after another and sneezing twice in succession, Sierra found the mermaid hidden in the corner. He was curled up sideways in a wooden bathtub, his hair stuck to his arms and chest, his tail fin spread nearly 1 meter wide and hanging on the edge, and his black scales were dripping with water. The sound of rolling waves outside could not be heard in the cargo hold, and Sierra cautiously approached him with the medicine in hand. "Hello." The face blocked by the silver wire immediately turned around, revealing a sharp mandible. A deep roar came from his throat. The smooth dorsal fin spine stood up, and a fish tail sunken in the water rolled up to reveal the same explosive hair. Side fins. The mermaid looked extremely angry, but unfortunately her mouth was taped and her neck was tied with a chain, and her hands were fixed with thick hemp ropes, so she posed no threat to Syrah. She just walked over and unscrewed the iodophore in her hand and stretched it forward in front of him. You need to disinfect it? Those fishing nets are very dirty. The black tail fin flapped vigorously, making the fragile barrel likely to crack at any time. Not expecting any good response from the mermaid, Syrah bent over and carefully wiped the wound on his shoulder with a cotton swab dipped in iodine. It will sting a little. With her gentle movements, the fragrance of virginity and medicine bloomed on the tip of the mermaid's nose. He tilted his head and lowered his light gray eyelashes. After feeling no threat, his fierce eyes gradually softened, and his dorsal and side fins, which had been in an upright position, slowly retracted. Syrah, who was highly concentrated, noticed his restraint and breathed out lightly. The smooth skin of the mermaid feels like a piece of fine silk, and the muscles of the whole body are covered by an indescribable layer of mucous membrane. The cracked wound destroyed this protective film. She carefully treated the wound on his shoulder, and then moved her eyes to the abdomen soaked in water and connected to the tail. There is also a transverse wound below the mermaid's navel. The skin and flesh are rolled up, and blood continues to seep out. The wound was so extensive that Syrah determined it was caused by a large fishhook on the boat. She turned her head to speak, and was caught off guard by a pair of lake blue eyes that were very close at hand. She subconsciously held her breath, and her heart started to beat loudly. Has he been staring at her from close range? Syrah lowered her eyes and coughed slightly. Can you sit on your tail and have some? He couldn't speak, he just stared at her in confusion. Well, you don't understand human speech. Syrah resignedly placed the medicine on one of the cargo boxes, put her hands into the barrel, and put her warm little hands against the smooth waist of the mermaid, making an upward lifting motion. Sit up quickly so I can apply the medicine. Syrah tilted her whole body and almost fell into the barrel. In order to maintain her balance, she broke out into a sweat in the cold night. The mermaid finally understood what she meant. The tail fin hanging outside the barrel retracted, the majestic fish tail entrenched at the bottom of the water pushed upwards, and the entire upper body surfaced. The bloody abdomen almost hit Syrah's face, and the smell of blood hit her nostrils. She subconsciously stepped back, just as the ship's hull encountered a small wave and gained momentum. Her sole slipped on the waxed floor and she fell forward. Thump! Half of her body fell into the barrel, hanging outside from her buttocks down, and her face gloriously bumped into a slightly raised area on the mermaid's lower abdomen covered with scales. The mermaid's expression changed slightly as he stood upright. He curled his long tail and instantly rolled Syrah, who was hanging upside down on the barrel, into the barrel. Wow! A large amount of water overflowed, and before Syrah, who was choked by the water, could resist, her body was wrapped around her slippery tail and lifted out of the water. She was kneeling in the water with her head raised, and the cold and smooth scales were close to her chest through her skirt. The mermaid with an upright upper body slowly bent down. The iron chain around his neck limited the distance he had to bend down. His long silver hair fell down onto her face, tangled with her dark brown hair floating on the water. Bang bang bang. Syrah, who was deeply afraid of being bitten, did not dare to move. The only thing that could be heard in the quiet cargo hold was her intense heartbeat. He lay on her neck and sniffed something, making her whole body tremble slightly. After a while, the thick black fish tail let go of her and returned to the bottom of the water. The mermaid didn't hurt her, and even touched her arm with his bound hands, and pointed at her wet belly, which was an obvious hint. Syrah sat sideways on a section of his sunken tail, shuddered and realized that this was asking her to continue applying the medicine. She found a place to stay in the bucket, carefully avoiding the mermaid's side fins, and stood up, holding onto the edge of the bucket to get the medicine placed on the cargo box. The wound was about a palm wide, and some areas were soaked and turned white. Sierra stretched out her hand and gently touched around his wound. She didn't notice the merman's eyes becoming darker and darker, and only said seriously, "You are at this level. It needs stitches, and medicine won't do much." She simply sprinkled antibacterial medicine on the wound and sprinkled a little more into the water. She raised her face and said, "Just hold on all night. I'll go find stitches tomorrow." He made a series of low grunts from his mouth, and leaned forward towards her, probably asking her to tear off the tape on her mouth. Sierra is still not sure whether his docile appearance at the moment is real or fake, and she doesn't dare to rashly tear off the tape to expose his shark teeth. She is not an Axie who has the system and the halo of the heroine. She is more precious about her life. Not yet. Sierra shook her head and used her hands and feet to climb out of the barrel. Seeing that it was difficult for her to climb, the mermaid's tail was bent below the buttocks so that she could step on it and jump out. He stared at Sierra's back. The black sleeveless skirt had completely fitted her body, revealing her beautiful body curves. Feeling the gaze from behind, Sierra lifted up her skirt and squeezed off some of the water, sneezed again, turned around and said softly and pitifully, "I have to go back and change clothes right now. If I get sick, I will be in trouble." Stable day 4 after signing, vote and comment. After dressing up as the evil girl in the second game, I opened my eyes and found myself in the Shur. Author, Mei Cheng. Chapter 7. She didn't expect him to understand. She would use her actions to tell the merman how much she had sacrificed for him. The dance party was still playing and there was no one in the corridor, so she quietly returned to her second classroom. After pouring a large vat of cold fresh water into the white porcelain bathtub in the bathroom, Sierra took off all the skirts that were attached to her body, took a deep breath and stepped into the cold water with her bare feet. The biting cold water was like a steel needle poking her legs. She sat in the water little by little, and no matter how uncontrollably her body trembled, she did not interrupt the self-abuse behavior. In order to avoid the vampire in Rose Hill, it was a good strategy to avoid social interaction when sick. If the mermaid could understand that she was also sick because of him, it would kill two birds with one stone. After soaking until her body was about to lose consciousness and her head began to feel dizzy, Sierra slowly stood up with shaking legs. The oval mirror directly in front of her could clearly reflect the girl's fair and plump body. A perfect evil stepsister, with big breasts and a perky ass, all the advantages of a coquettish bitch. Her white lips raised bitterly, and she knew clearly in her heart that if she used it well, this would be an important weapon for her to save her life. Facing the seemingly ferocious mermaid with little IQ, Sierra had a more elaborate plan. Betty felt very embarrassed about her behavior of running away in the middle of the party. When she knocked on the door of Sierra's room, she was surprised to find that her face was as pale as a ghost. "What did you do last night?" Betty saw that she was holding onto the door to barely stand up, so she kindly walked in and helped her up, then touched her hot skin and said, "You have a fever." Ahem. Sierra coughed twice. "I'm about to go to the waiter to call the doctor. Please help me." After all, she was the daughter of Earl Lizzie. Betty quickly called the doctor. "It's a common cold. The fever is not serious. You need to stay in bed and pay attention to a light diet." The doctor took out a jar of balsam and a few citrus and put them on the table. "This will make you feel better. Then I will miss a lot of interesting dances in the past 2 days," Sierra said regretfully. "I can't infect others." Betty stood by the bed and looked at her rather boredly. "So where did you go in a hurry last night?" "I went to see the Duke of Rose Hill. I ruined the appointment and wanted to apologize to him in person." Sierra lied casually, since she wouldn't need to see him in the next few days anyway. Betty sneered, turned around and left. "It's fine if you don't want to tell me the truth. We're not a family we know very well." The doctor who was organizing the medicine box next to him was also preparing to leave. Sierra just stopped him. I need some sutures and some anti-inflammatories. What do you want it for? The doctor frowned. Don't worry about it. She took out the valuable necklace that was not stored under the pillow and threw it to him. Don't tell anyone, this is what I gave to you. The doctor was at a loss as he held a gemstone necklace that could replace a whole house. Just to change a few catguts and anti-inflammatory drugs. If a critically ill passenger needs surgery, I can definitely help. Do you really want it? Sierra was impatient. Half an hour later, she had a light breakfast brought by the waiter, put on a black long-sleeved velvet skirt, and went out with a few packed pastries and medical supplies. She paused as she passed the library, went in and selected a fairy tale book. The content happens to be mermaid. It would also be a good idea to teach the mermaid a few words before Anna 11 does. The crew at the handle outside the cargo hold had already said hello when the accident happened last night. They checked to make sure there was no one around, opened the door and let Sierra in. Sierra didn't swallow any of the cold medicine and antipyretic medicine the doctor ordered her to take. After walking such a long way, when she went in with her things in her arms, her steps were even more staggering than when she was outside, and her posture showed weakness and exhaustion. Ahem. She coughed, and the mermaid, who was soaking in the barrel with his head down, looked up. His sharp and fierce eyes slowly softened when he saw her. He was close to the edge of the barrel, his chest pressed against the board, and he stared at her closely. How are you today? Sierra put down her things in the cargo box next to her and turned to look at him. The mermaid was stunned for a moment and nodded. He seemed to understand what she meant. In the dim cargo hold with only electric lights, Sierra walked to the barrel and observed him condescendingly. Those seaweed-like hair floated in the water like liquid bright mercury, and the face hidden under the hair was completely exposed in front of her when she raised her head. The mermaid who had restrained her temper had a pair of irresistibly charming eyes and a handsome face. His eyes were like lake water immersed in endless tranquility, and the shimmering water was the most erotic and alluring thing she had ever seen. Sierra lost her mind for a moment, staring at each other with him. No human being can resist his temptation. She slowly raised her hand, fingertips removed a strand of hair stuck to the mermaid's cheek, and pressed her palm against his cold cheek. You are so beautiful, she praised sincerely, without any trace of desire. The mermaid's eyes flickered, her tail that was sitting on the bottom of the water swung, and her upper body surfaced until her height was level with hers. Sierra's eyes also moved down to his strong chest and his jade-white skin. Her hands unconsciously slid down his face, caressing her neck and finally stopping on his chest. The skin under his palm was trembling regularly, which was where his heart was. The warmth ignited by the wandering little hands made the fisherman's body stiffen. He lowered his eyes, and his ears hidden under his hair were slightly red. Sierra didn't think there was anything wrong with taking advantage of her. She naturally retracted her hand and commented, "You are so cool." The mermaid looked at her rosy and soft cheeks, and made a low purring sound in her throat. He wants to talk. Sierra hesitated for a moment and took off the tape on his mouth. The mermaid's complete and exquisite appearance was displayed in front of her. His bright red head and head licked his dry lips, and he made intermittent sounds in his mouth, low-sighed. Sierra was stunned for a moment, and it wasn't until he repeated it to her again that she realized that he was greeting her. Your name? Raw-side, she asked softly. Law-side, he repeated quickly and accurately, and his hands that were bound into rice dumplings pointed at his chest. Law-side. Sierra was sure that he was introducing himself. A smile appeared on her red face, and she pointed to her chest. Sierra, my name is Sierra. The mermaid nodded, seeming to understand. Sierra brought over the prepared catgut and needle. She pointed to the wound on his abdomen, made a closing motion with her hand, and shook the needle and thread in her hand. I'm going to sew it up for you. The mermaid sat next to the barrel, with her entire belly exposed in front of her. His self-healing ability is good, and today's wound is much better than yesterday's bad situation. Sierra bent over and simply sterilized him, placed her palms against the edge of the wound, and carefully sutured him with catgut. After dressing up as the evil girl in the second game, I opened my eyes and found myself in the Shur. Author, Mei Cheng. Chapter 8. The mermaid frowned and didn't move randomly. It's a bit like performing a surgery on a killer whale. It feels like human muscle texture in the hand, but also has a different kind of silky feel. The film covering the surface is so slippery that Sierra couldn't pull it out several times. Needle. She was meticulously doing her unskilled handwork, and didn't notice the mermaid's head gradually lowering. When he pressed his lips to her neck, a long and smooth thing licked the back of her neck, and Sierra's whole body shot up like a spring, jumping 1 meter away. What you do? She clutched the back of her neck, leaning against the cargo box and looking in horror at the innocent-eyed mermaid. He licked his lips and stared at her silently. Gilug. His stomach growled. How could the swift and ferocious beasts of the deep sea approach when they were hungry? This was pure courting of death. Sierra, whose hair was about to stand on end, reacted and immediately opened the pastry she had brought, took out a piece of chicken cake and handed it to his mouth with great care. Try this. I can't catch it for you now, fish. Fortunately, he was quite obedient and opened his mouth to take the pastry from her hand. Seeing him staring at her while eating, as if he was treating her like a dinner party, made Sierra frightened. After feeding all the pastries to confirm that he was full for the time being, she was able to continue sewing, her movements even more careful and vigilant than before. Fortunately, the mermaid didn't make any strange moves, and was just observing her. Nearly 2 hours had passed since Sierra's death, and the high fever and exhaustion in her body made her dizzy. Seeing her discomfort and strangeness, Luosied lay on the edge of the barrel and called her, Sella. Huh? I need to take a rest. She sat down against the barrel in a daze. Sierra. The low, seductive voice called out her name exactly. Sierra. Sierra. With a different tone that sounded like singing, Sierra's body moved uncontrollably. She stood up while holding onto the wooden bucket, looking blankly at the charming sea monster in the middle of the water. He rose from the water, revealing his strong body, and opened his full lips wet with moisture, and kissed the girl with empty eyes. Thump. The giant fish tail swept her under the water, and something came from between her teeth. Sierra swallowed unconsciously, and the indescribable cool liquid slid from her throat into her stomach and spread throughout her burning limbs. All the cells in her body felt comfortable at this moment. A bloom. Sierra, who had lost her self-awareness, curled up on the dark fish tail, floating on the water with her cheek close to the mermaid's chest, panting slightly. Damn. Let go of Miss Sierra. I'm going to kill you, mermaid. Let her go. She was finally brought back to consciousness by the roars of 2 crew members. At this time, Sierra's skirt was rippling in the water, her fingers were clinging to the mermaid's shoulders, and her whole body felt indescribably comfortable. I'm fine, she called out to stop the 2 crew members who were about to come forward to save people. The mermaid's hands are tied and can't hurt me. You guys get out and I'll be out soon. Don't be fooled by him, the crew member reminded. Stay away from him. Get out, I'll be fine, Sierra said calmly. Seeing that she was sober, the 2 crew members looked subtle and slowly withdrew. Sierra raised her hand from the water and touched her forehead, looked sideways at the mermaid who was leaning leisurely on the barrel, and asked, Losside, what did you do to me? She was very aware of the changes in her body. She had a high fever one moment, lost consciousness the next, and all the discomfort subsided after she woke up. This is not normal. The mermaid opened her mouth to her and licked her lips. Sitting on the fishtail and watching such an erotic and seductive scene, Sierra's memory-interrupted brain instantly replayed what he had done when she was seduced. She covered her lips and looked at him with a blushing face. Your saliva still has this function. Sella, Treat. He leaned over and looked at her with his lips slightly parted. Therapy, he learned the vocabulary she spoke to him. So the kiss didn't mean anything in particular, he just healed her with his saliva, and now she needs to help him further treat the abdominal wound. This could have been done 2 hours ago, but now, he was thinking about whether she was trustworthy. Sierra pressed her palm against his strong chest, and touched his lips with her other hand. You want me to help you apply medicine? Is this the purpose of kissing me? Her fingertips penetrated his mouth, and a row of sharp teeth rubbed against the pads of her fingers, threatening to bite them off at any time. Sierra didn't panic at all. The fishtail under her body supported her, and her injured abdomen was exposed out of the water. When she didn't get any answer, she took back her hand, lowered her head and said lonelily, "Don't do this again." Raw-side blinked slightly. She used her fingers dipped in special potion to smear the mermaid's newly sutured wound. Visible to the naked eye, the hideous scar that had just been sutured was healing at an accelerated pace. I believe that in less than a day, it will be as good as ever. Looking at this wonderful scene, Sierra licked her fingertips and said, "No wonder I can recover so quickly from a cold. You are amazing." Feeling the praise in her tone, the mermaid smiled heart-wrenchingly. Climbing out of the water, she pointed to the mermaid book and her voice became flat, "I'll tell you a story tomorrow. We have to find a way to communicate." "Sierra." Luosiad called her name from behind. Sierra waved her hand. When she came out of the cargo hold, a faint smile appeared on her pursed lips. How could she forget that the mermaid's saliva has super healing power? She just wanted to portray a kinder and simpler image in front of him, but she didn't expect that he would choose to expose his healing power in front of her. Sierra touched her lips lightly, and this memorable kiss was really an unexpected gain. Trust has been initially established, but it is far from enough. On the way back to change clothes, Sierra met the servant next to Rose Hill again. He was waiting at the door of her room for a long time. "Miss Sarah." A gold-rimmed prom invitation card was handed to her, who was soaked all over. Invitation to a private ball for first-class passengers. Each class of cabin has a strictly restricted travel area. First-class passengers are free to travel downwards, while second and third-class guests can only stay in the entertainment venues they allow. Such an invitation is a good thing to get into the top society. Sierra narrowed her eyes, put her hand on her forehead and said weakly, "I'm sick, I have a bad cold." "You've been in the cargo hold all afternoon." "What's there?" the servant asked calmly. In his arrogant state, he didn't seem to care about her identity at all. Sierra stood up straight, her eyes alert. "Is the Duke's servant using it to follow me?" "Are you going to the dance?" He did not answer her question directly, and his calm tone was a bit cold. Please vote comment. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. After dressing up as the evil girl in the second game, I opened my eyes and found myself in the Shur. Author, Mei Cheng. Chapter 9. Thinking of the wine-serving maid who was tied to a stone and thrown into the sea, Sierra's back felt cold. She pretended to be calm and accepted the invitation card. "If he insists on inviting me to be his female companion, I can't refuse any more." "Your pleasure." The servant finished speaking proudly and left around her. When the others disappeared around the corner, Sierra held the invitation card tightly and frowned. She must not let him know that she knows that there are humanoid creatures called vampires in the world. According to the world structure of the novel, any human who knows the inside story will be sentenced to death. This is the same as the rules followed by the wolves. Escape is not the answer. The Duke may use more extreme means to verify the inside story he wants to know. She had to attend this dance and dispel his doubts. But this guy has the ability to read minds, and everyone's dirty thoughts at the dance are under his nose. How can she control her brain and stop her from thinking wildly? Sira sighed, it was impossible to do this. Dusk falls. Sira appeared in the first-class banquet hall holding an invitation card and was bright and flamboyant. Her simple black skirt with large puff sleeves and a few jewelry were destined to not hide her beautiful and outstanding facial features. Many super-wealthy businessmen cast new glances at her. For businessmen like them who have money but lack nobility titles, marrying a noble wife to achieve class crossing is a good idea. Sira politely refused some of the men who came to invite her to dance. She didn't find the Duke among the flow of jeweled people. She looked around and looked away, picked up a glass of champagne and found a long soft chair to sit down alone. After an afternoon of ideological work, she thought she should be able to cope with this crisis. The first track was polka. The lively and jumping rhythm and the girl's floral skirt dazzled Sira. She inherited Sira's death ending in the book, inherited her unique bitch beauty and femme fatale heart, but did not inherit her past and muscle memory. How do you jump on this thing? She'll absolutely break into shit. Miss Sira, right. A dark-haired man in a black tuxedo walked up to her, his handsome young face smiling. We met at the party, and you left in a hurry. Sierra didn't remember this person at all. Hello. My friends don't mean any harm. The second track is a waltz. I can. Before he could finish his implicit invitation, a middle-aged woman dressed like a large beige cake stepped forward and took his arm. Okay, Roger, you should go to bed, don't disturb me. She looked at Sierra for a moment and said, don't disturb Miss Sierra. Sierra really wanted to take the initiative to add someone who didn't have money to get in for her. A young lady who has no money and no favors will be ignored by dogs, which is a chain of contempt for contemporary aristocratic women. It's only 8 o'clock, Mom. The young man in a tuxedo was dissatisfied. I'll dance again. I'm waiting here, not dancing. Sierra smiled gracefully. Who invited Miss Sarah to enter the first-class cabin? The self-proclaimed noblewoman held her son's arm and looked unhappy. Just as a dignified man walked into the door, he gave a sparse greeting and asked Sierra to find his voice. Her eyes curled up. Duke Rosehill. The two people standing in front of her turned their heads. The young Duke, who was the richest after the king, came towards her. He was wearing a formal black suit made of expensive materials. His short light blonde hair was neatly combed back with hair wax. His dark eyes peered through the crowd at the girl with a bright smile. My ears were buzzing with countless dirty thoughts that were silent. The moment he looked at her, Rosehill raised his eyebrows slightly. The mind-reading ability suddenly failed, and the voice belonging to Sierra's heart was silent and silent. Miss Sarah, please wait. His voice was pleasant, but there was no warmth in his tone. The time is just right. Would you like to invite me to dance? She took the initiative to extend her hand to him. She will do the second track. The big hand wearing leather black gloves held her hand and walked towards the center of the dance floor. The lady in the cake skirt and her son, who were left standing aside, looked at each other, and they both saw the embarrassment in each other's eyes. The waltz was the only social dance Sarah had ever experienced. After doing enough psychological construction, she calmly put her hand on Rosehill's shoulder. You invited me to dinner and danced 2 or 3 times, and fell in love with me at first sight. Nothing to mention, he danced gracefully and skillfully, and his gorgeous and natural movements were not inferior to any other man present. That's a pity. Sierra looked disappointed. She deliberately stepped on 2 wrong beats, hooked her toes on his leather shoes, leaned forward and fell into his arms. The hand on her lower back quickly tightened to help her maintain balance, and the 2 bodies, one cold and one hot, were close to each other. I've liked you for a long time. Sierra raised her face, and her warm breath fell on his pale and cold chin. In order to be consistent on the outside, she was making crazy confessions to him in her mind. Like you, like you, like you, like you. All the dirty thoughts in his heart were covered up by the confession that was so close and had the loudspeaker turned on. the ability to read minds was inexplicably restored at this moment. Rose Hill lowered his head expressionlessly. His eyes were very dark, and the color was so rich that no light refraction could be seen, nor could Syrah's face be reflected. Hearing her passionate confession, no human emotions could be seen on this deep face. The woman who just spoke to you thinks that you are spying on his son. His tone was still calm, and he could continue to keep up with the beat while holding her upright with his hand. How do you know? Have you been listening to my conversation for a long time? Her mind was still telling him I like you, and her bright and pretty little face was revealed with a layer of pale pink that resembles a girl's spring. It is estimated that everyone present at this moment noticed that she, Syrah, was openly seducing this cold-blooded duke who seemed to be otherworldly. Rose Hill said nothing, his dark eyes half covered by his eyelashes staring at her closely. Any lies will be ignored by him, and Syrah can't say a wrong word. The waltz began to end slowly, and he remained indifferent, so she gently put the hand on his arm on one of his broad shoulders. I'm not interested in him. Although we met for the first time, I was in the newspaper. I fell in love with you the first time I saw your photo. Sierra tilted her head up, almost touching the tip of his nose, her cream brown eyes not evading at all. I don't know why you killed that maid, but I like you, so I am willing to accept and keep all your secrets. Taking the initiative to confess and show her loyalty, and portraying herself as an infatuated and fierce woman, were the only strategies she could think of. The lie is not complete enough. One corner of Rose Hill's lips raised with a sneer smile. I was just afraid that you would kill someone and silence me, so I refused your first invitation. After dressing up as the evil girl in the second game, I opened my eyes and found myself in the Shur. Author, Mei Cheng. Chapter 10. Sierra said this sincerely. She took a step away, turned around in his arms and returned to his arms. Witnessing a murder, it is easy to be killed by the murderer as the first witness. So she refused his first invitation. What a legitimate excuse. How do you think she died? Rose Hill lowered his eyelids, and his backlit side face was dark and cold. Is it important? Sierra tilted her head, the love in her mind was still outputting, her soft lips curled up slightly. I'm only on your side. His scrutinizing eyes narrowed slightly. You hid the mermaid in the cargo hold. Why? Sierra blinked and did not avoid the matter. I was deprived of all my property by Lizzie's mistress and her daughter. The reward for selling the fish will be my wedding dowry. Please don't interfere. He had an indifferent face, saying neither yes nor no. After the dance ended safely, she pretended to be reluctant to let go of his hand slowly. If you are willing in the future, I will come to marry you at any time with my meager dowry. A qualified lady from a famous family is reserved, but Syrah's unrestrainedness is far different from it. Rose Hill stated calmly, you are not worthy of me. This tone of arrogance and needy. As soon as these words flashed through Syrah's mind, his eyes changed. She pretended to be calm, trying to maintain her shyness that was about to burst. I think starting from tomorrow, the scandal between us will be spread on this ship. If you feel it is inappropriate, remember to come forward and clarify it. I will not cause any trouble to you. After bowing to him and saluting, Syrah immediately turned around and left. Even after such a short time, she still failed. She really wanted to pluck out her brain and slap her in the face. Looking at her back as she left in a hurry, Rose Hill sneered with the corner of her mouth twitching. Walking outside to the boat porch, Sierra beat her chest and felt annoyed. Before she could think of any remedy, two beautiful girls holding hands followed closely behind her. Sella, stay away from the Duke. That is Lily's fiancé. One of the red-haired girls warned her. Sierra turned her head and rolled her eyes at them, turned around and ran away. Just dealing with the two male protagonists is enough energy consuming, and she doesn't want to deal with these girls who have no brains and just want to get married. The crisis had passed temporarily, but Syrah kept looping in her head all night long, the words she had accidentally revealed to Rose Hill. She was completely insomniac. With dark circles under her eyes, she stood by the window and blew the cold sea breeze, which brought back some of her thoughts. She went to the waiter and ordered a large bowl of sashimi, then carried the food to the cargo hold. Sarah's frequent arrival also gave the crew members guarding the cargo hold other ideas. Don't jump into the barrel like yesterday. Don't be so curious about playing with a fish. They expressed what they had been holding in their hearts for a long time, fearing that Sarah would be reluctant to part with the mermaid in the future and would not let them sell it for money. She didn't pay attention to these words. When she entered the cargo hold, the mermaid was already lying beside the barrel waiting for her. "How is the wound?" She walked to the barrel, bent down and reached into the water. A small hand stroked his abdomen back and forth, and his smoothly manicured nails accidentally swept across the mermaid's slightly raised area covered with a thin layer of scales. His tail fin suddenly flapped in the water, his eyelashes trembled, and a low moan came from his mouth. Sarah curled up her fingers. She just touched a piece of smooth skin and some scales. "It's not completely healed yet, okay. It should be fine." Sierra Logosied stared at her, breathing a little quickly. "Huh? Do you want to eat fish?" Sierra shook her wet hand, picked up a piece of sliced sashimi and put it to his mouth. He opened his lips, hooked the tip of his tongue on the fish fillet, and rolled it into his mouth little by little. There was warm moisture coming from her fingers. The mermaid took the fish fillet and her fingertips into her mouth. The feeling of the fingertips being licked caused a tingling sensation to rush up to Sarah's tailbone. She blushed and pulled back her hand. "Don't bite my finger." He stared at her, thinking about what the words meant. Sierra put her hand behind her back and wiped it on her clothes. After wiping off the saliva, she picked up a few pieces and fed them to him. Every time the mermaid tried to eat her finger, she would tactfully avoid it and tell him not to do it. After going back and forth for a while, Logosied understood what this meant. After finally feeding him, Sierra sat on the cargo box next to the barrel and picked up the mermaid that was left here last night. "I'll tell you a story." She patted the edge of the barrel and motioned for him to come over and lie down. "There is a majestic castle deep under the sea, and there lives a mermaid prince. He has a beautiful voice that no one else can match. Unfortunately, he is a complete love brain. In order to get the princess with 3 boats, he is willing to exchange magic with the witch. The potion splits into 2 legs, and I walk on the land like a mountain of knives every day." Sarah lowered her head and looked at the charming mermaid lying obediently beside her thigh. She raised her hand and lifted his hair as smooth as seaweed, revealing the slender and beautiful swan neck. His side gills were like 3 light pink scratches. Still shrinking slightly. She poked the side gills on Lucid's neck with her hand, causing his shoulders to shrug and his lips to open slightly. In order to gain the princess's love, he killed her innocent and pitiful stepsister, abandoned her on the cold rocks, and turned her into a pancake. Her tone of voice, immersed in extreme sadness and indignation, was infected by rocks. He raised his head, and her face was clearly reflected in his clear and soft eyes. "Sierra," he called her softly. "You, the mermaid prince." Sarah poked his shoulder and pointed to the bridge of her nose. "I am the unlucky stepsister." She bent down in front of him and looked at his angular face. "Don't blindly fall in love with a woman who has 3 legs, do you understand?" What responded to her was a long, smooth tongue that licked her cheek intimately. Sierra was silent for 3 seconds, covered her face and slapped him on the head with a book. She was now convinced that this was definitely the stupidest and most deceitful of the 3 male protagonists. Logosied didn't care about the moderate slap. He raised his head and touched her arm with his hand bound into a ball by the rope. "Sela, don't be afraid." Her heart trembled and she lowered her head with a complicated expression. "I hope that when you fall into Anna 11's hands, you can still tell me not to be afraid as always." Sierra touched his cheek and sighed softly. After teaching Roxad the new version of the mermaid story all morning and teaching him a lot of words, she finally became too sleepy to bear it any longer. She yawned all the way to the Turkish bathhouse and spent a lot of money to buy herself a bathing spa. It is worth mentioning that the privileges enjoyed by the nobles of this era are the ultimate luxury that even wealthy businessmen in the 21st century may not enjoy. The high temperature in the bathroom made Sierra sweat profusely, and the masseur's superb skills made her blood flow smoothly and her whole body felt relaxed and comfortable. Vote.